Welcome. Today we're going to be taking a look at how we can design an HTML tag checker for our Java chatbot project. So let's go ahead and take a look at the steps it takes to actually make an HTML checker. So the first thing I have you do is I have you research what is an HTML tag. You actually need to understand what is HTML before you can actually decide how to identify it inside a string of Java. So we have to actually look how we can evaluate a Java string text value so we can see what's inside it. So I had you identify first what is HTML tag. So you get yourself familiar with that. If you haven't already done so, make sure you do so now so you can actually work with that, because otherwise this won't make much sense and that's not going to help you very much. Step 2, write up an algorithm, write up a plan. You need to actually think about how you're going to be doing this. Now this is not just like, oh, I spent 30 seconds. No. Actually take some time and plan out the steps. I broke this down in my solution into 3 specific steps on how to actually solve for finding an HTML tag. That's what this video is going to be based off of, but yours, your plan might be different, so please adjust accordingly. So write that plan down. It's actually very important. By actually writing that plan down, you're going to save yourself lots of time in the long run, because again, this is that problem-solving process. You're learning how to write code, not simply copy along and follow instructions on some YouTube video. After we write the plan, our next step is we want to code that minimal test. So we take a look at our plan and we find out what that minimal specific test is. So what's the minimum component test we have to do? We then, of course, write the code for that test, and we run checks against that test for step 4 against that minimal code. Does this actually match what an HTML tag is? Yes, no, and it returns true or false accordingly. So we have that appropriate value automatically built in from that very first step. Then we go iteratively to step 5. We're going to code the expanded test, that next more advanced version. And then check the expanded code, making sure it properly functions as well. Again, we're running that same series of tests we did in the first one, making it runs now on that second expanded version. Our 7th step is coding the final test. Now, final, of course, is in quotes and has a lovely question mark next to it right here, because we're not sure if we're actually done yet, but this is the plan of where I'm at right now with my 3-step process that I wrote in my plan up here in step 2. So I have them writing the code to get that final step working, making sure it's functional. And again, when you're working on doing this, you could use this to do more further and advanced projects. But again, this is the final step that we're looking at. And we're doing it in a process, so we can always come back and re-step that process through, rerunning that process again. After we've gotten that check and see if it works properly, we reflect and we write down how this worked. We go back and look back at our original algorithm and see how close our algorithm or plan was we wrote up in step 2 to our final version of our code, making sure we document that, because we want to make sure that we make those deep connections in our brain and attach that problem-solving process that we have up here to the actual code we write on this computer, and how we can actually solve and use this again later on in the future. So let's take a look over here and look at the idea of what a minimal test is for HTML. So these are the 3 tests I came up with for running my HTML checker project. So the first test is there a tag? Okay, check that off. Is there an opening tag? Yes, check that off. Is there a closing tag? Check that off. So we're identifying the 3 minimal components. Do we have the actual components to make up a tag in HTML? Do we have an opening tag? Do we have a closing tag? If we have those 3 things, oh, that passes the first iteration of our HTML tag checker. Do we have those 3 pieces? We then expand our test, making sure we actually have a more proper thing. Do we have an open tag followed by a closing tag, regardless of what's inside the actual text itself? These 3 dots, whatever these, the dots in between represent potentially valid answers. We don't care what the text is inside it, but do we have an open tag, something possibly, and then a closing tag? Do we have the actual location of those things properly handled? We then expand again our 3-quel right here, and we're going to do a complex tag. We have an open versus a close. When we're talking about complex tags, do we have the difference between an opening tag and its matching closing tag, because they don't have all the same text? Versus when we're simply talking about the idea of an open and closing tag for the basic expanded tests, they actually match directly. And so we can look at how we can actually solve that. So again, let's move over again one more step and take a look at that. Let's take a look at what makes up the idea of our minimal test. The first thing we have is, do we even have a tag in our string? So we first have to check to have a tag that we have an opening angle bracket and a closing angle bracket. If neither of these are present, then there is no tag and it's not valid HTML. That's the first check we have in minimal test. Our second minimal test is, do we have an opening tag? Do we have an angle bracket followed by some text and a closing angle bracket? Oh, cool, we have an opening check. Sweet. If we don't have an opening tag, then again, we fell out and we return. Then do we have a closing tag? We have an opening angle bracket, the / and a matching string with the closing opening tag right here for the closing tag, followed of course by our closing angle bracket. So this is that minimal structure right here. Do we have this thing present inside it? First, do we have any angle brackets? Second, do we have an opening tag? Finally, do we have a closing tag? If we don't have any of this, open angle bracket, closing bracket at all, we fell automatically. If we don't have an opening tag at all, we fell automatically. If we don't have a closing tag, we fell automatically. But if we have both an open and closing tag, then we have an HTML tag and we're good to go. The next step for our expanded test, we're going to go one step further. We want to make sure the relationship between the opening and closing tags makes sense. Do we have an opening tag and a closing tag in the proper sequence? Or is it reading left to right? The opening tag should be first and the closing tag should be after. We have to make sure that that sequence right here, we designed it in our expanded test, where it has the opening tag. We have to make sure that we have the correct sequence right here where we have the opening tag, something, and then the closing tag. They can't be a reverse backwards. It doesn't work like that. So we have to make sure they're in the correct order. And so that's where we have to use the locations on that. This is going to be happening by using the index of method in Java to properly assert that the location of that opening tag is before the location of the closing tag. Finally, we have our second level, or finally, we have our third level of our expanded test. Does the expanded test 3, do we have on complex tags, for example, the image tag, table tags, etc., where they have multi pieces of information inside that? On our complex tag, we have a single keyword followed by optional or other pieces of information that go along with it that are after the actual keyword. When we close that tag, we don't want to have that whole giant pile of text attached to it. Instead, we want the HTML keyword after the actual slash. So on that expanded version, we're making sure that instead of having this full big matching giant opening tag, closing tag on, say, like an image source or a table tag or a div tag, something that uses CSS to style or format it, we only have the keyword after the angle bracket inside here after that slash. We're making sure we actually properly have that handled so we can have a proper closing tag. And so that's the idea that we have for our 3 steps to do our HTML checker. As we go through this, just a quick thing. As soon as we have a condition or test that fails, we should return our isValid value of false because we did not actually meet that condition. So as soon as we meet any of these conditions, so as soon as we don't have an opening bracket, as soon as we don't have a closing bracket or an opening tag or a closing tag, those automatically fail when we leave out. We only return true if and only if we make it all the way through all of our tests, making sure all of the code is properly there. And again, I like to always have a variable for my return type, so I explicitly assign true to when it finally passes the value, and then return that variable rather than simply returning true randomly throughout my code. I automatically assign false because it has failed that reason for that specific thing, and I return false at that point for I assign false to the variable is valid, and then I return false to the point that it fails that test because I have not met that test condition, and we can go on. Again, as we're looking through this idea of the structure, when we're looking at the fact that we have these required conditions to go through this, we have the idea of nested conditions. This has to be true, and this has to be true, and this has to be true. I can make that into a single giant, huge, single line if block statement, but because that makes it much harder to read and much harder to troubleshoot, I have to make sure I fill at the appropriate time, so it's much easier to have a nested sequence. Oh, do I have this? And do I have this? I go inside this and I can make that condition happen. And so my design and my algorithm reflects that appropriately. So I have first this test, and then I come in and I check this test, then I come in and check this test, and if I keep continuing passing those tests, I return true. Otherwise, I will return false because I've failed that test appropriately, and I leave the situation at that point. I hope this is a helpful way to learn how to break down the HTML method and get some information. Cheers and have a great day. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.